The idea that the Cold War was a period of sustained peace is one of the most successful myths ever produced by institutional memory. It was not peaceful. It was a war conducted in silence, in sealed rooms, in the language of coordinates and yield calculations and response windows measured in minutes. The weapons were real. The targeting was real. The plans were finalized, approved, rehearsed, and updated with the same bureaucratic regularity as any other government function. What was suspended was not violence, but its visible form. What was managed with extraordinary precision was the appearance of normalcy, while an entire civilization prepared in careful administrative detail for its own destruction. There were 27 defense plans during the Cold War that were designed never to be seen. Not by the public, not by most of the people who would be affected by them, and in several cases, not even by the elected officials nominally responsible for authorizing their execution. They existed in a space between policy and reality that has no clean name. They were operational. They were funded. They were staffed by human beings who came to work every day and refined them. And they were built on a foundational assumption that their authors rarely stated aloud, which was that the systems they were creating might eventually have to function without human input at all. That assumption did not emerge from carelessness. It emerged from mathematics. The calculations made clear, very early in the nuclear age, that the time between detection and impact was too short for reliable human decision-making. The missiles moved faster than the political process. And so, gradually, through incremental decisions made by committees that no one remembers, authority was redistributed, not taken away from humans entirely, but placed in procedures, in checklists, in automated sequences that would continue executing even if the people who designed them were already dead. What follows is an account of those plans, not a celebration of them, not a condemnation, an account. The institutions that produced them were not staffed by monsters. They were staffed by careful, technically sophisticated people who believed, with complete sincerity, that building a machine capable of ending civilization was the most responsible way to prevent civilization from ending. The logic was coherent. The outcome was a world in which catastrophe was never more than one malfunction away, and in which the distance between a false alarm and the end of everything was sometimes measured in a single individual's decision to do nothing. The first of these plans was not called a defense plan at all. It was called a war plan. The distinction was bureaucratic, but it mattered, because a war plan implied agency, intent, a decision to act. The Strategic Air Command's first serious nuclear war plan, developed in the early 1950s under General Curtis LeMay, was not a plan for responding to a Soviet attack. It was a plan for delivering a preemptive strike of such overwhelming force that the Soviet Union would cease to function as a coherent military power before it could retaliate. LeMay called it killing a nation. The phrase appears in declassified documents with the same clinical detachment as any other operational objective. The plan called for delivering the entire American nuclear arsenal in a single massive strike, targeting not just military installations but cities, industrial centers, and population concentrations simultaneously. The logic was that anything less than total destruction left enough Soviet capability intact to retaliate, and retaliation was unacceptable. The plan was never formally authorized by the president. It was never submitted for congressional review. It existed as operational doctrine, developed by military planners operating within a chain of command that gave them extraordinary latitude to interpret their mandate. When civilian officials eventually learned the full scope of what SAC was planning, some of them were genuinely disturbed. The response from LeMay and his staff was essentially that the civilians did not understand the operational realities. The documents from this period, when you read them in the flat language of declassified archives, convey a profound institutional confidence that the people closest to the weapons were the people best equipped to decide how they would be used. That confidence was not limited to SAC. It pervaded the entire nuclear establishment, and it produced a second plan that operated in parallel to the official chain of command for most of the 1950s. This was the pre-delegation of nuclear authority. The official policy was that only the president could authorize the use of nuclear weapons. The operational reality was that authority had been quietly delegated downward through a chain of classified directives to theater commanders and in some cases to individual base commanders who were authorized to use nuclear weapons under certain conditions without waiting for presidential authorization. The conditions were defined vaguely enough to give those commanders substantial discretion. If communications were lost, if there was evidence of an imminent attack, if the chain of command appeared to have been destroyed, local commanders could act on their own judgment. This was not a secret within the military. It was a secret from the civilian leadership and from the public. The Eisenhower administration was aware of it and in some ways sanctioned it, on the theory that the Soviets needed to believe that American nuclear response would be automatic and unavoidable. If they thought there was any gap between an attack and a response, that gap became a vulnerability. The deterrent value of nuclear weapons depended on their perceived inevitability. So the pre-delegation was part of the deterrence architecture, a feature rather than a flaw, except that it also meant that the decision to begin a nuclear war had been distributed across dozens of individuals, each operating under their own interpretation of ambiguous instructions in conditions of fear and incomplete information and potential physical danger. The documents describing this pre-delegation were classified at levels above top secret. Some of them remain classified today. What has been reconstructed through declassified fragments and the testimony of former officials suggests that for most of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the formal chain of nuclear command was a description of how things were supposed to work, while the actual operational reality was considerably more diffuse and considerably more dependent on individual judgment at the lowest levels of the command structure. The third plan addressed a problem that the military had recognized almost immediately after the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was the problem of surviving an attack long enough to retaliate. The deterrent value of nuclear weapons depended on the credible threat of retaliation. If the Soviets could destroy American nuclear forces in a first strike, the deterrent collapsed. This produced a series of plans for ensuring the survivability of the nuclear force, and those plans had consequences that extended far beyond the military. The most significant consequence was the development of what became known as continuity of government planning. The assumption underlying this planning was that a Soviet first strike would target Washington and the major population centers, and that the result would be the physical destruction of the civilian government. The question was, what would fill that vacuum? The answer, developed in classified plans throughout the 1950s, was a shadow government, a parallel administrative structure that would survive the attack and assume authority over whatever remained of the country. This shadow government had its own facilities, its own communication systems, its own chain of succession that extended well beyond the constitutional order, and it was built to operate in conditions where democratic accountability was simply not possible. The facilities for this shadow government were constructed in secret, some of them inside mountains, some of them underground, some of them in locations that were never publicly acknowledged. The one that eventually became public was the facility beneath the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, a massive underground complex built to house Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. It operated in secret for decades, maintained by a private contractor whose employees were told to describe their work as television repair services. The facility was outfitted with everything a functioning government might need, including a broadcast studio, a medical facility, dormitories for hundreds of people, and food and water supplies sufficient to sustain operations for 60 days. 60 days was the planning assumption for how long the post-attack environment would be survivable. What the facility did not have, and what none of the continuity of government facilities had, was a coherent plan for what the surviving government would actually do. The facilities were designed to preserve the structure of government. The question of what that government would govern in a country where most of the population was dead and the infrastructure had been destroyed was not addressed in the planning documents with the same rigor as the engineering specifications. The implicit assumption was that survival itself was the objective. The details would be worked out afterward. The fourth plan was not about survival. It was about escalation management, which was the elaborate intellectual framework developed primarily at the Rand Corporation to make nuclear war seem like a rational enterprise that could be conducted in stages, with each stage calibrated to produce a specific political result short of mutual annihilation. This framework produced a vocabulary that became deeply embedded in Cold War strategic thinking. Terms like limited nuclear war, controlled escalation, and counterforce targeting that implied a degree of precision and control that the actual weapons and command systems could not support. The plans built on this framework called for nuclear strikes against specific military targets, leaving civilian populations and enemy cities intact as hostages against further escalation. The theory was that both sides would prefer to stop short of total destruction if given a face-saving off-ramp, and that a carefully controlled nuclear exchange could serve as an extremely intense form of coercive diplomacy. The problem, which critics identified at the time and which has been confirmed by every subsequent analysis of actual command and control systems, was that the concept of controlled nuclear war bore no relationship to how nuclear war would actually unfold. The communication systems required to manage a controlled exchange did not exist. The command structures were not designed for it. The weapons themselves were not accurate enough for it, particularly in the early years. And the psychological and organizational stress of operating under nuclear attack was not something that could be modeled in a peacetime planning exercise. The plans were developed anyway because they served an institutional purpose. They gave civilian policymakers a language for discussing nuclear weapons that did not require them to confront the actual consequences of their use. They gave military planners a framework for requesting more weapons and more resources on the grounds that the existing arsenal was not sufficiently calibrated for controlled escalation. And they gave the entire nuclear establishment a veneer of rationality and controllability that made the enterprise politically sustainable. The fifth plan was the Single Integrated Operational Plan, known as PSYOP, and it was the plan that governed American nuclear targeting for most of the Cold War. The PSYOP was developed in 1960 in response to a situation that had become genuinely alarming to civilian officials who managed to get a look at what the military was actually planning. Before the PSYOP, each branch of the military had its own nuclear war plan, and those plans overlapped, contradicted each other, and in some cases targeted the same locations multiple times with weapons whose combined yield was far in excess of anything that military logic could justify. The Navy had plans, the Air Force had plans, the Army had plans, the theater commanders in Europe had plans. None of them were fully coordinated. Some of them were actively in conflict. The PSYOP was supposed to rationalize all of this into a single coherent targeting plan. What it actually produced, at least in its initial version, was a plan for delivering somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 nuclear weapons against Soviet, Chinese, and Eastern European targets in a single massive strike, with no option for a more limited response and no ability to exclude allied nations from the target list, even if political circumstances changed. The first PSYOP included targets in Albania, which was in the process of breaking with the Soviet Union at the time the plan was finalized. The planners had not updated their targeting to account for the political reality. The weapons would have fallen on an ally in everything but name. When civilian officials saw the PSYOP for the first time, some of them were visibly shaken. The briefings described a plan so large and so automated that it would function essentially on its own once initiated. There was no pause button. There was no partial execution option. There was no mechanism for saying, stop after the military targets and wait to see if the other side is willing to negotiate. The plan was a single irreversible action that would kill hundreds of millions of people and probably trigger a Soviet response that would kill hundreds of millions more. The Kennedy administration ordered revisions to the PSYOP specifically to create more flexible options. Those revisions were made, at least on paper, But the underlying tension between the theory of flexible response and the operational reality of a nuclear arsenal built for massive retaliation was never fully resolved. The weapons were designed for one thing. The plans required another, and the gap between them was filled with institutional optimism and analytical frameworks that sounded rigorous but rested on assumptions that had never been tested and never could be. The sixth plan was built around a specific fear that emerged in the early 1960s and never entirely went away, which was the fear of an electromagnetic pulse attack. A nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude would generate an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to disable electronic systems across a vast area. A single weapon detonated at the right altitude over the center of the United States could potentially disable the communication and command systems that the nuclear force depended on. This would not destroy a single American city. It would not kill a single American civilian directly, but it would blind the command structure at the moment when it most needed to see. The plans developed to address this vulnerability produced some of the most technically ambitious and least publicly discussed programs of the Cold War. One of them involved aircraft that would fly continuously, around the clock, carrying the communication equipment necessary to command a nuclear strike from the air. These aircraft, known by various code names over the years, were airborne command posts designed to survive the initial pulse and the physical destruction of the ground-based command centers and relay orders to the missile and bomber forces. They flew real missions continuously for decades. The crews who staffed them spent their careers preparing for a scenario that everyone hoped would never occur and that everyone in the program understood was entirely plausible. Another program involved hardening the communication systems themselves, burying cables deep enough and shielding equipment thoroughly enough to survive both the pulse and the blast effects of near misses. The engineering involved was extraordinary. The cost was substantial. And the underlying assumption, which was that it was possible to design a command and control system robust enough to survive a nuclear attack and continue functioning reliably enough to direct a coherent response, was one that the engineers and planners believed with genuine conviction and that subsequent analysis has suggested was probably not achievable in practice. The seventh plan was the one that came closest to being used. In October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a moment of successful diplomacy, a confrontation that ended through a combination of American resolve and Soviet prudence. That memory is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The complete picture, assembled from documents declassified over the following decades and from the testimony of participants on both sides, reveals a situation in which the mechanisms for preventing accidental nuclear war were strained almost to the breaking point, in which multiple decision nodes experienced failures or near failures that could have escalated without warning, and in which the outcome depended not on the wisdom of the principles, but on a series of decisions made under extreme pressure by individuals operating far from the center of authority. The most significant of these decisions was made on October 27, 1962, aboard a Soviet submarine designated B-59, operating in the waters near Cuba under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress. The submarine had been out of contact with Moscow for days. The crew did not know whether war had already begun. The depth charges being dropped by American forces overhead, intended as signaling devices to force the submarine to the surface, were indistinguishable from actual attacks in the confined and terrifying environment of a submarine that had already exceeded its operational limits. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, concluded that war had started and ordered the arming of the nuclear torpedo aboard his vessel. The torpedo had a yield equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Its use against the American naval forces overhead would almost certainly have triggered a nuclear exchange. It was not used because of a procedural requirement that had been built into Soviet submarine operations, which mandated that the use of nuclear weapons required the concurrence not just of the captain, but of the senior political officer and the flotilla commander, who happened to be aboard the same vessel. The flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to concur. He argued for surfacing and attempting to communicate. Savitsky eventually agreed. The torpedo was not fired. The documents describing this incident were not declassified until decades after the crisis. The American officials managing the crisis did not know it had happened. The planners who had designed the crisis management procedures had not anticipated the specific combination of circumstances that produced it. The outcome depended on a single individual's judgment in conditions that were designed to produce exactly the opposite judgment. It was not a close call in the sense of being almost avoidable. It was a close call in the sense that avoidance required a specific human decision that easily could have gone the other way. The eighth plan governed what would happen in Europe if the Cold War became a hot war, and it was a plan that the European allies of the United States were not fully informed about until late in the Cold War, at which point some of them were genuinely alarmed by what they learned. The plan, in its basic structure, called for the use of tactical nuclear weapons to compensate for NATO's conventional inferiority against the Warsaw Pact forces arrayed across the Central European plain. The Soviets had more tanks, more artillery, and more infantry than NATO could field in the early years of the alliance. The nuclear weapons were the equalizer. What this meant in practice was that NATO war plans envisioned the detonation of hundreds of nuclear weapons on German soil in populated areas among the civilian populations of the country that NATO existed to defend. The plans were not secret within the alliance, but they were not discussed publicly, and they were not discussed with the German public with anything like the honesty that the situation required. The Germans who lived in the areas designated as nuclear battlefields did not know the specific details of what had been planned for their towns and villages. The officials who knew those details did not volunteer them. The tactical nuclear weapons themselves were stored in bunkers across Western Europe, guarded by American troops under a system of physical security that improved substantially over the decades, but that in the early years was, by contemporary accounts, remarkably casual. The weapons were genuine, the security was inadequate, and the authorization procedures for their use in a conflict were, in the early years, heavily pre-delegated to theater commanders who had been given authority to use them if communications with higher command were lost. The ninth plan addressed a question that became increasingly urgent as the Soviet nuclear arsenal grew, which was the question of how the United States could absorb a first strike and still retaliate effectively. The answer developed in the early 1960s was the nuclear triad, the distribution of nuclear weapons across three delivery systems: land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and bombers, each of which was independently capable of delivering a devastating strike, and each of which was vulnerable to different attack vectors. The theory was that no Soviet first strike could eliminate all three legs simultaneously, and therefore some retaliatory capability would always survive. The plans built around the triad were elegant in theory and deeply complicated in practice. The submarines carrying ballistic missiles operated in a communications environment that was fundamentally hostile. Radio waves do not penetrate seawater effectively, which meant that communicating with a submerged submarine required specialized, very low-frequency transmitters that could only send short, simple messages at extremely low data rates. The messages were pre-coded. The submarines received their orders through a process that was reliable enough for routine operations, but that became considerably more uncertain in a degraded communications environment. The plan for what a submarine commander should do if communications were lost for an extended period was not clearly specified in the early years of the program. The commanders had standing orders that covered the most likely contingencies, but the orders were written by people who could not fully anticipate the range of situations that might actually occur. The result was that submarine commanders operating under communications blackout had significant discretion about how to interpret their orders. In a crisis situation, that discretion could mean the difference between a response and an inadvertent first strike. The 10th plan was a Soviet plan, or rather a fragment of a Soviet plan that became known to American intelligence through a combination of technical collection, defector reports, and eventually the partial opening of Soviet archives after the Cold War ended. The plan addressed the Soviet version of the survivability problem and produced a system that was so extreme in its conception that American analysts, when they first learned of it, initially questioned whether it could be real. It was called perimeter by the Soviets and dead hand by the Americans, who eventually wrote about it, and it was designed to ensure that a Soviet nuclear response would be automatically delivered even if the entire Soviet military and political leadership had been destroyed. The system worked by monitoring for signs of nuclear attack, seismic activity, radiation levels, communication failures. If those signs indicated that a nuclear attack had occurred, and if the normal command channels had gone silent, the system would, after a specified delay, automatically launch the Soviet strategic missile forces without requiring any human authorization. There would be a final check, a last human in the loop, but the conditions under which that final check occurred were conditions in which the individual performing the check had every reason to believe that the Soviet Union had already been destroyed, and that their only remaining function was to confirm what the automated systems had already decided. The system was designed not primarily as a practical weapon, but as a deterrent signal. The Soviets wanted the Americans to know that any first strike would automatically trigger a response, that there was no scenario in which the United States could destroy the Soviet leadership and then negotiate surrender terms with a government that no longer existed. The deterrent logic was coherent. The operational implications were a system that could, under the right combination of sensor failures and communication disruptions, interpret a peacetime situation as an attack and launch without any human decision to do so. The Americans did not learn about perimeter until years after it had become operational. When they did learn, the response within the intelligence and policy communities was complicated. Some analysts viewed it as confirmation that the Soviets were rational deterrence theorists who had solved the survivability problem in the most direct way possible. Others viewed it as evidence of a fundamental instability in the nuclear balance, a system that was designed to fire under conditions of uncertainty, and that could therefore fire based on false information. The debate was not resolved. The system continued to operate. The 11th plan was American, and it addressed the same problem from a different direction. Instead of automating the launch decision, it automated the communication of launch orders. The program, which operated under various classified designations over the years, was designed to ensure that launch orders could be delivered to American missile forces even after the destruction of the normal command network. It involved a series of airborne and ground-based relay systems, hardened communication links, and ultimately a weapon system known as the Minuteman Integrated Command and Control System that could receive a launch order through multiple redundant pathways simultaneously. The practical effect was that a launch order, once initiated by a surviving authority, would propagate through the system automatically, reaching every missile silo and submarine simultaneously without requiring any intermediate human confirmation at each step of the relay chain. The missiles could be launched from Washington, even if every intermediate command post between Washington and the silos had been destroyed. The system was elegant, and it worked. It also meant that a launch order could not easily be recalled once initiated. The same automation that made the system robust against attack made it resistant to cancellation. The 12th plan was the one that produced the most documented near misses, and those near misses accumulated over the decades of the Cold War into a record that defies the comfortable interpretation that the nuclear peace was maintained through wisdom. It was a plan for how to respond to indications of an incoming attack, and its repeated failure was not in the response itself, but in the reliability of the indications. The early warning systems for detecting Soviet missile launches were extraordinarily sophisticated for their time, and extraordinarily prone to false alarms. The fundamental problem was that they were designed to detect something that had never happened, using physical principles that had been validated in testing environments, but that interacted with the real atmosphere and real electromagnetic conditions in ways that were not always predicted by the models. The result was that the systems produced alerts, They produced alerts regularly. They produced alerts that looked briefly exactly like the real thing. The most extensively documented of these false alarms occurred at NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, on multiple occasions in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In one incident, a technician inserted a training tape into a live warning system, causing NORAD's computers to display an incoming missile attack that was entirely simulated. The error was caught within minutes, but the response procedures had already been initiated. Bomber crews had been placed on alert. Missile crews had received preliminary warnings. The chain of events had begun moving before the error was identified. In another incident, the early warning satellites detected what appeared to be a Soviet missile launch. The analyst on duty, a young officer named Stanislav Petrov, who was monitoring the Soviet early warning system on the other side, had a parallel experience. His system indicated an incoming American attack. He had minutes to decide whether to report the alert as real or dismiss it as a malfunction. He dismissed it, based partly on procedure and partly on personal judgment. His judgment was correct. The system was malfunctioning, but the procedures did not require him to exercise personal judgment. They required him to report the alert as real, which would have initiated the Soviet response sequence. He did not follow procedure. Petrov's decision to deviate from procedure prevented possibly an accidental nuclear war. It also illustrates a fundamental tension in the design of nuclear command systems. The tension between procedures designed to ensure rapid response and procedures designed to prevent premature response. Every feature of the system that made it more likely to fire in response to a real attack also made it more likely to fire in response to a false alarm. Every feature designed to prevent false alarms introduced delays that reduced the effectiveness of the response. The systems were engineered to resolve this tension, and they were not able to fully resolve it. And the resolution that occurred in practice was a series of individual decisions made under extreme pressure by people who were not always supposed to be making those decisions. The 13th plan was one that emerged from a specific technical problem identified in the late 1950s, which was the vulnerability of land-based missiles to a Soviet first strike. The missiles were fixed in known locations. The Soviets knew where they were. As Soviet missile accuracy improved, it became increasingly plausible that a Soviet first strike could destroy a significant portion of American land-based missiles in their silos before they could be launched. The response to this vulnerability was a doctrine known as launch on warning, which was exactly what the name implied. The missiles would be launched not after a Soviet attack had been confirmed by physical impact, but after warning systems had detected the launch of Soviet missiles during the window between detection and impact. Launch on warning was controversial within the defense establishment from the moment it was proposed. The objections were obvious. The warning systems were not perfectly reliable. Acting on warning rather than waiting for impact meant acting on information that could be wrong. And acting on wrong information meant initiating a nuclear war in response to a false alarm. The defenders of launch on warning argued that the alternative, waiting for impact, meant absorbing a first strike that could destroy the retaliatory force entirely, which would undermine deterrence and make a first strike rational for the Soviets. The debate went back and forth for years and was never definitively resolved. What emerged was a policy that officially maintained launch on warning as an option, while simultaneously conducting programs designed to make land-based missiles more survivable, on the theory that if the missiles could survive a first strike, there would be less pressure to launch them on warning. The 14th plan was about civil defense, and it was a plan that revealed more clearly than almost anything else in the Cold War record the gap between official reassurance and institutional reality. Civil defense, the idea that civilian populations could be protected from nuclear attack through preparation, evacuation, and sheltering, was promoted by the American government through most of the Cold War as a serious and viable policy. The reality, as documented in classified assessments that were not made public until decades later, was that the civil defense program was primarily a psychological management tool. It was designed to maintain public confidence, to prevent panic, and to sustain the political will necessary for continued defense spending. It was not designed to actually save significant numbers of lives in a nuclear exchange. The classified assessments of casualty projections in a nuclear exchange were consistent and devastating. The models showed that in virtually any realistic exchange scenario, the immediate casualties would be in the tens of millions. The delayed casualties from radiation and infrastructure collapse would be in the tens of millions more, and the civil defense measures available to the American government could not materially alter those numbers. The shelters were inadequate. The evacuation plans assumed road networks and administrative capacity that would not exist in a post-attack environment. The food and medical stockpiles were insufficient. The planning was real. The protection it offered was not. This was known within the government at the highest levels. It was not communicated to the public in a way that made it real. The duck and cover drills, the shelter programs, the government pamphlets about preparing for nuclear attack, these were maintained not because they would protect anyone, but because the alternative, telling the public that they could not be protected, was considered psychologically and politically unacceptable. The information management was not malicious. The people who maintained it believed with some evidence that public panic would be more destructive than public ignorance. They were managing fear administratively, exactly as the system required. The 15th plan was developed in response to a crisis in the command and control architecture that became apparent in the early 1960s. The crisis was simple. The people with the authority to authorize nuclear weapons use were vulnerable. The president could be killed. The chain of succession could be decapitated in the opening minutes of a war. And if the chain of command was destroyed before launch orders were issued, the retaliatory force had no authority to act, and deterrence collapsed. The plan that emerged from this crisis was the nuclear authorization system, which was revised and elaborated over the following decades into an architecture of extraordinary complexity. The basic structure involved the Presidential Emergency Satchel, known colloquially as the football, a briefcase carried by a military aide who accompanied the president at all times, containing the authentication codes and communication equipment necessary to authorize a nuclear launch. The system was designed so that only the president or a specifically designated successor could issue authenticated launch orders. The authentication codes were changed regularly. The procedures were rehearsed. The system worked as designed, except that the system also revealed, when examined carefully, a fundamental ambiguity about what happened when the president was incapacitated but not dead, when the president was unreachable but not confirmed destroyed, when the succession of authority moved through individuals who might themselves be targeted. The procedures for these scenarios were classified, and they were revised repeatedly, because each revision revealed new gaps. The scenarios that the planners had not anticipated tended to be the scenarios that actual crises produced. The system was always one step behind the contingencies that reality was capable of generating. The 16th plan was the one that governed American nuclear policy toward China, and it was a plan that reflected one of the most fundamental tensions in Cold War strategy, the tension between the logic of deterrence and the logic of prevention. China exploded its first nuclear device in 1964. Before that explosion, there was a period of several years during which China was developing nuclear weapons but had not yet acquired them, during which the United States had the option of preventing China from becoming a nuclear power through military action. The classified documents from this period reveal a serious internal debate about whether to exercise that option. The arguments for prevention were laid out in planning documents with the same analytical rigor as any other strategic proposal. China under Mao was considered ideologically aggressive and potentially irrational by American standards. A nuclear-armed China would complicate the deterrence calculus in Asia in ways that were difficult to model. The window for prevention was narrow and closing. The arguments were not dismissed. They were ultimately rejected, partly on the grounds that the Soviet Union would not tolerate an American attack on Chinese territory, partly because the military option was assessed as less reliable than the intelligence available suggested, and partly because the legal and political framework for a preemptive war against a country that had not attacked the United States was understood to be problematic. The rejection was not absolute. There were contingency plans for military action against Chinese nuclear facilities. Those plans were not executed. The window closed. China became a nuclear power, and the plans were revised to account for that reality. The 17th plan was about the management of nuclear weapons in the hands of allies, and it was a plan that created tensions that lasted for decades. The NATO alliance depended on the extended deterrence guarantee, the American commitment to defend European allies with nuclear weapons if necessary. That commitment required that American nuclear weapons be stationed in Europe, in the hands of Allied forces, available for rapid use in a conflict. It also required elaborate mechanisms to ensure that those weapons could not be used without American authorization. The mechanisms designed for this purpose were known as permissive action links, electronic locks built into the weapons themselves that required an authenticated code before the weapon could be armed. They were effective, technically sophisticated, and were progressively improved over the years. They were also, in the early years of the program, not as secure as they were represented to be. Declassified documents from the 1960s reveal that some nuclear weapons stored in Europe were not equipped with permissive action links at all, relying instead on physical security measures. Other weapons had links that were set to simple codes that were not changed regularly. The security architecture was real, but it had significant gaps that were not acknowledged publicly. The 18th plan addressed a specific scenario that became increasingly alarming to American planners as the Soviet arsenal grew in the 1960s and 1970s, which was the scenario of a Soviet surprise attack specifically designed to destroy the American command and control structure while leaving the missile force intact. The theory was that if the Soviets could kill the president, destroy the Pentagon, and eliminate the communication infrastructure in the opening seconds of a war, the American missile forces would be intact, but unable to receive authorization for launch. The deterrent would be preserved, but the retaliatory capability would be frozen. The plans developed to address this scenario involved creating multiple parallel command authorities, distributing the capability to authenticate launch orders across a wider range of officials and facilities, and building communication systems that could survive the destruction of Washington and continue functioning. They also involved the development of highly survivable command systems based on aircraft, submarines, and land vehicles that could continue operating in a severely degraded communication environment. The unintended consequence of these plans was a command architecture that was specifically designed to function in the absence of central authority, which meant it was also a command architecture that could potentially function in response to false information if the central authority that would normally evaluate and filter that information had been destroyed. The redundancy that made the system survivable also made it more autonomous. The autonomy that made it more autonomous also made it more dangerous if the information it was acting on was wrong. The 19th plan was about the biological and chemical weapons programs that ran in parallel to the nuclear program, largely invisible to the public discourse about Cold War deterrence. The United States maintained a significant biological weapons program through the 1950s and 1960s, developing weapons based on anthrax, botulinum toxin, and other pathogens, and the plans for their potential use were integrated into the broader war plans in ways that were never fully public. The program was terminated by President Nixon in 1969 on grounds that were partly strategic and partly moral, and the stocks were destroyed, and the public story of the American biological weapons program was effectively closed. The Soviet program was not closed. The Soviet biological weapons program, which was far larger than the American program even before the American program was terminated, continued to expand through the 1970s and 1980s under a cover organization that presented itself to the outside world as a civilian pharmaceutical research institution. The program employed tens of thousands of scientists and produced weapons based on pathogens that had been genetically modified to resist treatment and to spread more effectively. This program was not known to American intelligence in its full scope until after the Cold War ended, when former Soviet scientists began to speak publicly about it. The scale of what was revealed was genuinely shocking to people who had spent careers monitoring the Soviet military. The plans for the use of these weapons were never made public. The targeting doctrine, the delivery systems, the integration with conventional and nuclear operations, all of this remains classified or destroyed. What is known is that the program was maintained until the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and that significant portions of the infrastructure and the knowledge base were not secured in the chaotic period following the collapse, raising questions about where the materials went that have not been definitively answered. The 20th Plan was one of the most technically ambitious of the Cold War and also one of the most consistently misrepresented in public discourse. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by President Reagan in 1983, was presented publicly as a program to develop a defensive shield against nuclear attack, a system that would render nuclear weapons obsolete. The classified technical assessments of the program, prepared by the same scientists who were expected to make it work, were considerably more skeptical. The fundamental problem was not engineering, it was physics. Destroying ballistic missiles in flight requires intercepting objects moving at speeds and following trajectories that defeat any known interception technology at scale. A Soviet first strike would involve not dozens but hundreds of missiles, and the mathematics of intercepting that volume of targets in the compressed time frame available were not encouraging. The classified assessments did not prevent the program from proceeding. They were not the primary driver of the program. The primary driver was strategic signaling. The Soviets, whatever their technical analysts might have concluded, could not afford to assume that the American program would fail. They had to respond. And responding required significant resources that placed additional strain on an already strained economy. The program was a competitive challenge as much as a defensive system, and it succeeded in that dimension even if it never produced a functional missile defense. The 21st Plan was about nuclear weapons at sea, and it generated a series of incidents during the Cold War that were not acknowledged publicly for decades, and that reveal, with unusual clarity, how the systems designed to prevent accidents were constantly stressed by the operational realities of maintaining a nuclear arsenal in an environment as uncontrolled as the ocean. American and Soviet submarines operated in close proximity throughout the Cold War, pursuing each other through the depths, conducting surveillance operations, occasionally colliding. The interactions were not always accidental. There was a deliberate practice of close-in surveillance that was accepted on both sides as a norm of Cold War competition. But that also created conditions in which mistakes could have immediate catastrophic consequences. The submarines carrying nuclear weapons were themselves weapons in a fundamental sense, and the loss of a submarine in unclear circumstances was the kind of event that could, in a crisis environment, be misinterpreted as an attack. Several American submarines were lost during the Cold War. The USS Thresher sank in 1963. The USS Scorpion sank in 1968. Both were nuclear-powered, and the Scorpion was carrying nuclear weapons. The causes of both losses were investigated, and the investigations produced explanations that were classified at the time and partially declassified later. What the declassified record makes clear is that the Navy did not always know immediately what had happened to a submarine that ceased communicating, and that the first hours after a submarine stopped reporting were hours in which the worst-case explanations could not be immediately ruled out. The 22nd Plan was about the nuclear weapons that were lost, the accidents and incidents in which American nuclear weapons were destroyed, scattered, or submerged in circumstances that made recovery impossible or impractical. The American military terminology for these events was broken arrow, and the number of broken arrows during the Cold War was larger than has ever been officially acknowledged, and has only been reconstructed through decades of investigative reporting and partial declassification. The incidents ranged from fires at storage facilities to crashes of nuclear-armed aircraft to a submarine sinking while carrying armed weapons. In some cases, the weapons were recovered. In other cases, they were not. Off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, in 1958, a B-47 bomber collided with a fighter during a training exercise, and the crew jettisoned a Mark 15 nuclear bomb, which sank in Wassaw Sound. Extensive searches at the time and in subsequent years have not recovered it. The bomb remains there, according to the available evidence, somewhere on the bottom of the Sound, degrading on its own timetable, surrounded by fishing boats and pleasure craft, and the ordinary human activity of a coastal community that does not generally think about what is beneath the water near it. The 23rd Plan was the one that governed American nuclear policy in the Middle East, and it was a plan that came closer to execution than has been publicly acknowledged. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egyptian and Syrian forces made significant initial gains against Israel and the Israeli government was confronting the possibility of a catastrophic defeat, there were direct communications between the Israeli government and the Nixon administration about nuclear weapons. The precise content of those communications remains classified. What is known from declassified documents and subsequent accounts is that Israel placed its nuclear forces on alert, and that the American government was aware of this alert, and that it influenced American decision-making about the pace and scale of resupply to Israel. The American plans for the Middle East nuclear scenario had to account for an ally with undeclared nuclear weapons, a set of adversaries who were also clients of a nuclear power, and a conflict environment in which the pressures toward nuclear use were real and immediate. The planning for this scenario was done under conditions of unusual complexity because it required simultaneously supporting Israel's conventional defense, deterring Soviet intervention, and managing the risk that Israel's nuclear weapons might actually be used. The plans have not been declassified. The scenario they were designed for came genuinely close to occurring. The 24th Plan was about the end of the Cold War itself, or rather, about what was supposed to happen at the end, if the end took the form of Soviet collapse rather than military defeat. The planning assumption through most of the Cold War was that any resolution of the conflict would be either military, meaning it would involve the actual use of the weapons that both sides had spent decades building, or diplomatic, meaning it would involve negotiations leading to arms control agreements. The scenario that actually occurred, the rapid collapse of the Soviet state under the combined pressure of economic failure and political delegitimization, was not a scenario that most Cold War planners had modeled in detail. The consequence was that when the Soviet Union dissolved, the nuclear arsenal that had been built and maintained under centralized control was suddenly distributed across 4 successor states, only one of which was Russia. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus all found themselves in possession of nuclear weapons for which they had no operational control, no targeting infrastructure, and no clear legal authority. The process of transferring those weapons back to Russia and the process of negotiating the denuclearization of the non-Russian states occupied significant diplomatic and financial resources through the 1990s and was largely successful in achieving its immediate objectives. What it did not do was address the broader institutional infrastructure of the Soviet nuclear program, the knowledge, the materials, the technical expertise that was now distributed across a post-Soviet landscape of underpaid scientists and inadequately secured facilities. The 25th Plan was about NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, which were and remain among the least publicly discussed aspects of the alliance's nuclear posture. The arrangement involves American nuclear weapons, B-61 gravity bombs, stationed at air bases in several European NATO countries under a system in which the host country's aircraft and pilots are certified to deliver the weapons in a nuclear conflict. The weapons remain under American custody, and American authorization codes are required to arm them. But the delivery systems are operated by the host countries, and the host countries' pilots train for nuclear delivery missions. The political logic of this arrangement is to distribute the burden and the commitment of nuclear deterrence among alliance members, to ensure that European allies have a direct role in the nuclear mission, and therefore a direct stake In the nuclear deterrent, the operational logic is more complicated. The weapons must be retrievable quickly in a crisis, which means they are stored in ways that optimize accessibility rather than security. The storage facilities have been assessed periodically by independent analysts, and the assessments have consistently noted that the physical security of the weapons is less robust than would be desirable given their destructive potential. The arrangements have been politically resistant to change because any change that increases security tends to reduce the credibility of the rapid deployment capability that the arrangement is designed to provide. The 26th Plan was the one that dealt with the Soviet naval buildup of the 1970s and the American response, and it was a plan that produced a doctrine of such aggressive forward deployment that it created its own set of escalation risks. The maritime strategy, as it was called for American naval forces to operate in the direct vicinity of Soviet submarine bastions, the areas close to the Soviet coast where Soviet ballistic missile submarines operated under the protection of Soviet naval and air forces. The purpose was to threaten those submarines, to force the Soviets to divert resources to their defense, and to demonstrate that American naval forces could penetrate Soviet defensive zones at will. The problem with this strategy, identified by critics at the time and confirmed by subsequent evidence including Soviet planning documents, was that the Soviets interpreted aggressive American naval activity near their SSBN bastions as preparation for a first strike. The ballistic missile submarines were the Soviet assured destruction capability. If the Americans could destroy them in the opening moments of a war, Soviet deterrence collapsed. Therefore, aggressive American activity near those submarines, even in peacetime, was interpreted in Soviet planning as a potential precursor to a first strike, which meant that in a crisis, that activity could trigger the exact response it was intended to deter. The 27th Plan was not a single plan at all, but a category of plans, the continuity plans for the nuclear arsenal itself, the plans designed to ensure that the weapons and the knowledge required to maintain them would survive, even if the civilization that produced them did not. These plans had a quality that distinguished them from all the other plans in this account. The other plans were designed for a world that still existed and was trying to preserve itself. These plans were designed for a world that had already been destroyed and was trying to continue in some form. The facilities, the personnel, the procedures, the communication systems maintained under these plans represent a form of institutional commitment that operates beyond the normal logic of policy. They are maintained not because anyone expects to use them, but because the alternative, allowing them to atrophy, is considered unacceptable by the institutions responsible for them. They are tended with the same professional care and bureaucratic consistency as any other long-term government program, by people who come to work every day and perform their functions competently and responsibly in preparation for an event that everyone hopes will never occur. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The announcement was made by Mikhail Gorbachev in a televised address on December 25th. By that point, the physical infrastructure of the nuclear confrontation, the missiles, the submarines, the command posts, the early warning satellites, the communication networks, the targeting databases, the authorization procedures, the launch protocols, had been in continuous operation for over 3 decades. The machinery did not stop on December 25th. The missiles remained in their silos. The submarines remained on patrol. The targeting databases continued to be updated. The procedures remained in force. The institutional memory that sustained all of this continued to function in the organizations that had been built to sustain it. The treaties that followed, START I and its successors, reduced the numbers of weapons. They did not eliminate the weapons, the plans, or the infrastructure. The early warning systems that had generated false alarms throughout the Cold War continued to operate. The command and control systems that had been designed to function without human judgment in degraded conditions continued to function. The nuclear sharing arrangements in Europe that had raised questions about authorization and security continued to operate. The perimeter system in Russia, the dead hand, continued to operate. The institutions that had spent decades preparing for a nuclear war did not dissolve when the political framework that had justified their existence dissolved. They adapted. They found new rationales. They maintained their capabilities, their personnel, their procedures, and their operational readiness. The Cold War ended without resolving the systems that had sustained it. Those systems remain operational today, tended by professionals who understand their function and maintain them with the same careful, competent, bureaucratic consistency that characterized every phase of the enterprise from the beginning. The weapons are real. The plans are real. The gap between a false alarm and the end of everything remains what it has always been, not large,